So officially, hello and welcome one and all to the Reset Show number 11. Yes, it's true, number 11. This is our first episode of the year 2021. And to help us get back in the groove, we have a very special guest in Sam Knowles, who is an author, psychologist, podcaster, storyteller, data sniffer, and insight expert, all-round top human being. So Sam, thank you. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. We'll start the conversation in a moment. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks to, of course, as always, to my co-hosts, Belinda Ganaway from Fathom XP and Katie Austin on production duties and Emma Bridger from People Lab. I am Justin McCarran from Everyday Resilience, for the record. Before I hand over to Emma, let me also say thank you to our live studio audience who have joined us today for the recording. We have a number of our regular special guests. We've got Debbie, it's lovely to see you. And also I know we've been joined by Nadine Roth. Thanks for joining us, Nadine, and Jacob Guberg as well. We're very pleased to have you all. Forgive me if I don't name all of you by name, but we have a certain number of you have been invited to come and take part in the show. So we're delighted to have you. Thank you. Thank you. I am going to finally say, of course, the biggest thank you goes to you, our dear viewers on YouTube and listeners of the podcast. This is why we do it. We do it for you. So thank you for viewing and listening, and particular thanks from us for some of the lovely feedback we've been receiving. So we're back. Let's do this. Number 11, Emma Bridger, I'm handing over to you.
Oh, thank you, Justin. And I'm delighted to be back in 2021 with the first Reset Show of the year. Really excited about today's show. Loving this idea of being a data sniffer. I'm really interested to hear about that. But got some great guests lined up already. So really happy to be back. For those of you who are maybe new to the Reset Show, just a little bit of background as to why we do this thing. Really, this started out as a kind of a conversation and a chance to get together with like-minded people to sort of talk about this idea of how we can use the pandemic as an opportunity to do some really groundbreaking, pioneering, exciting, fantastic things in the world of work to essentially make the world of work better for the people that we work with. That's kind of the synopsis of why we're here, what we're trying to do. And we're joined every show by brilliant guests who really inspire thinking and get us to sort of view the world of work in a slightly different way. And I'm really excited by being joined today by Sam, today's guest. And I've just bought his book, so very excited by that. So I'll hand over to B, who can introduce Sam and give Sam some airspace to tell us what he's going to talk about today. So over to you, B.
Thank you. So yeah, just adding us to the third of our sort of introductions, delighted to have Sam here. Sam and I were introduced to a mutual friend that I know through the IABC, based purely on proximity. We live about 10 miles apart. So we've known each other for a few years, and we've managed to do some work together in that time, which has been brilliant. Most recently, we've done a really lovely program all about discovering and articulating organizational purpose. Since then, one thing you have to know about Sam, he makes absolutely the best coffee as well, in the very best mugs. And over some of that delicious coffee, we've been talking about empathy, particularly about empathy as a route to insight. So I wanted to get Sam onto the show to explore if we could somehow cross this bridge. So Sam's background is, I'll get him to tell you about it, is it's very much sort of marketing comms, that sort of focus for insight. But I'm interested in to see if today we can build some bridges between those two worlds and think about actually what does this world of data and insight storytelling bring to the world of people and culture. So I'm sort of coming at this from two areas, and hopefully we'll get to look at all those questions. So there's always the organizational level sort of questions, what is data and insight, and how can we use the first to get to the latter, and what does that mean for people and culture? And then on a personal level as well, what can we all do to be a little bit more insightful in our work and lives? So if we're super clever on time, we'll get to cover both of those areas. So fingers crossed. So Sam, I'm going to ask you a really good question, easy question first, which is there anything we haven't said about you that you would like to say? And maybe that's answering this question, what is a data data sniffer?
I'm not sure I am a data sniffer, actually. I mean, you could say all sorts of things, but you've welcomed me. You've been excited about my presence, about my book. If Zoom showed blushes, then there'll be plenty of blushes coming to you from Gray Lewis this afternoon. A data sniffer. Well, Tim Harford, the long-time presenter of Radio 4's More or Less, where they look at the stats behind the news. It was created more or less by Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter, who will, if you weren't familiar with him before the pandemic, I think if anyone can be said to have had a good pandemic, it's David. But Spiegelhalter was one of the people that created More or Less. Tim Harper's just written this book called How to Make the World Add Up, and he has 10 rules that people looking at data should apply. The first one is, if you have an emotional reaction to a data point, you should put your screen or tablet or book down, walk around the block, and then ask yourself why you do. I think that's a good piece of advice. The second one is that you should really sniff the data. Is there something a bit rank? Is there something a bit off about this data? What can it be? And I don't necessarily mean from a technical, nor does he, from a technical perspective. Is this unexpected? If it's unexpected, then either it's telling us something really important, or it's an outlier. And one can easily get sucked down rabbit holes by outliers. So no, I don't think there's anything else to say.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to ask you another easy one. I'd like to know, what is insight? And in your book, you talk about it being genuine insight is usually an expression or manifestation of empathy. And on this show, we're fascinated by empathy, but I don't want to lead the winners. So tell us, what is insight?
So for me, I've lurked in the hinterland of marketing communications, corporate communications, brand communications for 32. This is my 31 years. And in that time, I increasingly became alienated by the way with which the word insight was used. Particularly as data became more and more prevalent and people started using data and information and casual observations in place of insight. I run a small 3-person consultancy that is called Insight Agents, and it was deliberately 7 and a bit years ago. I deliberately chose both the abstract word insight that I am about to define for you, I promise, but with the concrete verbal noun of agents and agency, getting your fingernails dirty to get to insight. I deliberately called it that because I'd become so alienated with so many brands and so many agency people throwing the world around with gay abandon. For me, it's not necessarily a simple thing, and it's a sort of thinking metacognitive thing, and we'll come back to that. But insight for me is a profound and useful understanding of a person, an issue, a thing, a topic, a subject matter. It's profound because it answers the so what questions that we get from data. What does the data mean? But it's useful. It has to be useful as well, because it enables us to go on to do the now what should we do as a result. Now, clearly that's relevant in communication, but it's relevant in corporate and brand communication. It's relevant in interpersonal communication. It's relevant in leadership and followership. It's relevant in getting on with one's kids doing homework and homeschooling under lockdown. I mean, I think if one can get to profound and useful understanding regularly, then it's likely that one will have a more impactful and calmer life.
Love it.
Oh, and then you asked about empathy, right? You wanted me to make the bridge to empathy. So I don't think they are the same thing. I think in the Insight book, I talk about insight as empathy. They're definitely not one and the same thing. But the quote that I always like to use is maybe from an improbable source, Atticus Finch, the hero lawyer from To Kill a Mockingbird, who says to his daughter Scout, And since reading Laura Bates, I've taken to changing the gender of pronouns. I've with my son's girlfriend's suggestion, I've read a couple of Laura Bates books, you know, the Everyday Sexism and Girl Up. So I've taken to changing antique pronouns. So you never really, because he's talking to his daughter, Atticus, and he says his, but not in my version. He says to his daughter, you never really understand a person until you consider things from her point of view, until you climb inside of her skin and walk around in it. Now, if you're in marketing communications, or if you're in leadership development, if you're in a leadership position and you want somebody to do something else, not you want to tell them to do something, but you know, we're all, as the American writer Dan Pink says in his book To Sell Is Human, we are all in the moving business, the persuading business. Whether we're a leader, whether we're a brand, whether we're a politician, I think perhaps our dear Home Secretary could have done with a few empathy lessons before her 5 o'clock broadcast on Monday of this week. Perhaps. Anyway, but unless you understand, unless you can see things from the perspective of somebody else, you cannot hope to be insightful. Insight, I think, is very much about understanding, getting in the mind, the mindset, the shoes of those you're looking to influence. That's why I think insight and empathy are connected.
And is that our first bridge then? So if we remove you temporarily from your natural habitat of marketing and comms and think more about business strategy, people and culture, is that the bridge? Is that why insight matters in people and culture?
Yeah, I think absolutely that's why it matters, because and I think it's more than, I do think it's a kind of universal prescription for life. And by that, I'm not trying to say I've written or stumbled across something so unbelievably profound. But, you know, like all good insights, when they slap you in the face, they are bleeding obvious. They are absolutely, surely somebody else has thought of this before. Sure, oh no, they haven't. Really? Have they not? Oh, well, we must be onto something. You know, language is this brilliant kind of recursive, infinitely possible tool and set of devices. I reckon that sentence that I just stumbled through has never been said before on this planet. I hope not. It wasn't very articulate. But you know, the work that Chomsky did around universal grammar, but also around the brilliant recombinatorial nature of language, that anything can be expressed. It just probably hasn't been already. I think the same is true with insight, because not another definition, but another way of thinking about insight is that it's a combination of old and old making something new. Mr. 80-20 rule, Vilfredo Pareto, the Italian philosopher, said that an idea is nothing more than a recombination of old elements. You just add old things together and you get something profoundly new. And we're brilliant at doing that. You know, people say, oh, I'm not creative, I'm not insightful, I never have insights. That's one of the human superpowers, that we are brilliant at joining old and old together and making something new. You know, look at, I heard the other day that 2 of the 3 vaccines that are now approved for use in the UK were developed about a year ago. Almost without sight of, you know, on one of them on a computer model. That's pretty impressive. I mean, you know, it needs to go through regulation and tests and the rest of it. But we're really, really good at, I think, at combining old and making new. I think one of the reasons that people struggle to get to insight is that they don't have a framework or a way of, they don't have a way of thinking about thinking. You know, we have these brilliant supercomputers sitting between our, you know, the world's most powerful supercomputers sitting between our ears, and yet we don't really have a way of understanding how it works. You know, we've got some ideas about plumbing and wiring, and we've got some ideas about modules, but this supercomputer that simultaneously does bottom-up and top-down processing, simultaneously has big ideas and tiny elements of big ideas. We don't really have much way of looking inside it. I am a believer in the subconscious and the massive power of the subconscious to help us do this recombinatorial thing. Some people believe the mind is flat. Indeed, there's a book by a guy called Nick Chater called The Mind is Flat, who maintains that everything happens on the surface. I'm afraid I don't agree, and I'm afraid I don't think the evidence supports him. I think that our supercomputer is constantly adding bananas to helicopters and seeing if that makes something useful. But the kind of the conscious sphincter in our mind is kind of holding those things in because they're not useful. But I think we're consciously doing that. We're constantly doing that. I guess the trick is allowing a few more of those banana helicopters to come through.
Great, and we're going to come to that definitely. And I've definitely got some questions around the framework and how you allow the brain to do that work. But I'm wondering whether, I'll ask this question then, and then we'll hand it over to, I know Debbie's got a question in the chat, and if anybody else has got a question, do chuck it in. And obviously, Justin, Emma, anybody else has got a question. So my question was, I've forgotten. Why is insight so difficult to get to? Is it because of this difficulty of thinking about thinking, or
yeah, it is. So Daniel Kahneman, the Princeton psychologist, the author of that very difficult, but good and correct, I think, book, Thinking Fast and Slow, System 1, System 2 Thinking. I'm sure you've talked about that on here before. Here's a good quote from him. He says that thinking is to humans as swimming is to cats. They can do it, but they prefer not to. So I think that is very true. We're not brilliant at being metacognitive. Because we lack the Kahneman's opposite number at Harvard, Steve Pinker. He wrote this huge book. Actually, the whole thing that got me interested in psychology a long time ago really was this book, How the Mind Works. Oh, that's a nice sounding book, I thought. I'll read that. And he says at the end of the first chapter, he says, by the end of this book, I'll have shown you how the mind works. And then he concludes at the end of the chapter that we lack the cognitive architecture to be able to understand how the mind works. Oh, define metacognitive. Just thinking about thinking. There's a question there. Just thinking about thinking. So the word meta, I love this, and this is in one of the, Emma, you'll get this in the footnotes of the book. You won't get this in the main bit of the book, but I am giving you one of the footnotes. So the word meta means after in Greek. I was a classicist originally before becoming a psychologist. Aristotle wrote a book called The Physics, which was all about the body and so on. And then he wrote a book about stuff that wasn't necessarily manifested physically, but he wrote it afterwards, and it was called The Metaphysics. And ever since, the word, it's just a preposition. It just means thinking. Metacognitive, thinking about thinking.
Lovely, thank you. Justin.
Yes, thank you.
Thinking about thinking.
My goodness, Sam, what have you done? You've just thrown a bomb and exploded my world. It's fantastic. What a way, folks, to start 2021. And I'm watching some of my colleagues' faces as well, particularly Perry's. Has been a joy to watch. I think if we just said, hey, Perry, should we just hand over to you and you can just talk for I think it would be that in itself. I would like to see Perry and Sam just sparring backwards and forwards. That's another one for our dinner parties. Maybe we need that. Anyway, I'm rambling. We have a question from Debbie, and I know Nadine has already jumped in and offered some of her thoughts. Nadine doesn't have access to audio, as I think you know today, so she will be communicating through the medium of the typed word in the chat. But the question is a great one. Thanks for getting us started, Debbie. So I'll just read it out for you, Sam, in case you haven't had a chance to look at it. So some leaders tend to be very data-driven. And when it comes to strategic decisions and running businesses, we all know leaders like that. But how can we help them understand and achieve empathy if this notion of standing in the shoes of people is alien to them?
So that's a brilliant question. Thank you, Debbie. I like that very much. I think that, increasingly in the, what are we in, an democracy, when CFOs, it's usually the CFO, or it's very often the CFO rather than the head of people who becomes the CEO, right? And they have been schooled in the importance of making calm, rational decisions, and they always need the data and the dashboard and yet another dashboard in order to be able to justify that. They need to go back. They need to know, I think, a little bit more about how we make decisions. And I mentioned Kahneman before. I think the work that he's done around cognitive heuristics and shortcuts, the shortcuts that we make in our thinking, which are often mistakes. They're shortcuts and they serve us okay, but they help us make mistakes. I think that his body of work, particularly with his longtime collaborator Amos Tversky, with whom he won the Nobel Prize for Economics several years ago. I think what he's shown is that we make our decisions emotionally and we justify them rationally. We think we use the uniquely human cerebral cortex that only we have to make our decisions. And the cerebral cortex is slow. It takes seconds or quite a lot longer to assess data, and that's where data sits. That's where data kind of filters through to, or that's but that's not how we make decisions. We make decisions emotionally using the ancient reptilian limbic brain that we share with birds, reptiles, and all of the mammals. Our choice of car or perfume or garlic bread, is it going to be flat or is it going to be round with traditional slices? We make those decisions emotionally, and we make those decisions about business investment and strategy and so on. We make those decisions emotionally and we justify them rationally. Now, I think that those leaders who Debbie's talking about in her questions about strategic decisions, it's important to be seen to have weighed all the evidence. But actually, I think they're kidding themselves if they think that they're making their decisions rationally, and that they really do need to realize that the emotional component, if not always dominant, is much more important than they realize. And that's why I think that empathy that's another reason why I think empathy is so important, because that enables us to understand the motivations of others better if we can do that. And so I think those strategic decision makers should I don't know, get a bit more emotional. Yeah.
Thank you, Sam. And what you won't have seen while you were talking is Perry's contributed some thoughts in the chat. Perry, over to you.
Thank you.
Carry on the discussion there.
Yeah, so my reactions are unfiltered. So yeah, you were right to comment on those. Sam, I remember reading Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, and it was a quiet revelation for me that there is a different way to make decisions other than data tables. But since that book, there's lots of people been saying, what does Gladwell know? It's all a load of rubbish and blah, blah, blah. So I think he's sort of seen the scorn that was poured on people like Clayton Christensen with disruptive innovation and what have you. So I just wondered where you sit really on what I think Gladwell was trying to say to us, is that, it isn't just a data table. It is also these hunches and these feelings and these emotions are really valuable and can even challenge sometimes logic for good reason. So I just kind of wondered where you are. Are you nearer to the Gladwell side of, yes, you've got to...
I know, I absolutely am, but it's because of, and I cannot remember because it's quite some time since I read it, but I have absolutely no doubt that he will refer at least in part to some of the Kahneman and Tversky work. I have absolutely no doubt that is in there. I think Gladwell is absolutely right. I think that because we only process a tiny amount of the data and the stimulus that comes into us, and because we rely on some fairly faulty decision-making shortcuts, we can make the wrong decisions. We can make the wrong decisions emotionally. In terms of prejudice, in terms of all sorts of things. We can make the wrong decisions emotionally, but I do think that despite that scorn that was poured, it's almost a question of don't kill the messenger. And I think I subscribed, maybe like lots of people, because they were doing a buy one get one free to masterclass. At the very, I think almost the day, Monday the 27th, was it, or Monday the 26th of March last year, with a friend. So we got it for half price, and then I binged a few of them and then haven't really since. I must go back to it before my subscription runs out. But there's a Gladwell one on storytelling there, which is a good one. It is a very good one. The best one is Chris Voss on FBI hostage negotiation. and the use of what he calls tactical empathy. That's I think the most interesting one I've watched there. I'd read the book, but it's dramatized brilliantly. Anyway, no, Gladwell, on one level, he's not remotely original because he's permanently a secondary source. What I think where I think he is original in this kind of Pareto explanation is that he takes something here and brings them together. So when he's talking, I don't think this is in. It is in Blink, at the beginning of Blink, and I can't remember the name of the marriage guidance academic he talks about.
I remember.
But he's talking about this marriage guidance expert who, within 5 minutes of his first meeting with a couple, can tell if they're going to split up, and it's whether or not, with 95% confidence, whether or not one, particularly both, are using language and expressions of contempt. And then there's the story in Blink. There's the story of the kouros, the Greek sculptures that were fake or not. So again, when you get really good at doing something, when you do it a lot, when you do the 10,000 hours, which again he's had lots of scorn poured on him for, but look at David Beckham. What did David Beckham do between the ages of 6 and well, probably still today, take free kick after free kick after free kick in the park? And he was quite good at that. That's kinesthetic intelligence, but I think it's exactly the same. But I think what he's good at is taking old and creating something, and that something new is not necessarily new scientific advance, but it's bringing quite complicated ideas to millions. And he's done that since. I mean, he's been on the New Yorker since 2006. It's still his job. I think sometimes when people stray into territories where maybe there's a bit of previous that they're not aware of, or that they're seen to be riding roughshod over it. I thought it was slightly unfair, but I'm not his defender, and I am with him because I think he is guided by the Kahneman work. I think.
Thank you.
Thank you both for that. I've one more thing to say about this, and that is that Nadine actually popped an early reply or an early response, Debbie. You've probably seen that in the chat, and it's great. It's a great piece of advice because it's super practical and it applies to everything, which is actually put that into practice yourself. So get in their shoes and go, well, what works for them is data. Well, get them some data about the importance of empathy, isn't it? It's like, if that's the currency that person values, then find a way to communicate that in their currency. So I really like that advice, Nadine. That applies to kind of every conversation, isn't it? Really is. Well, that's the secret, and that comes back to what you were talking about, Sam, about Dan Pink's work about us all being in the moving business, and he talks a lot about that in that book, To Sell Is Human. That sense of that's really the key, if nothing else. And in fact, I'm just reading Getting to Yes with Yourself by William Ury, and I'm having another one of those experiences that I'm sure we've all had of going, oh, this is great. This is the same theory packaged up in a different format. And I don't mean that at all pejoratively. I mean that genuinely. This is the nuts and bolts of human beings and how we actually communicate and what works. But it's packaged up this time through the lens of negotiation, whereas it might be packaged up through all sorts of different lenses. So anyway, that's very current for me as well, this thinking of putting yourself in the other person's shoes. So thank you, Debbie, for the question. Thank you, Sam and Perry, for your input. And thank you, Nadine, for your response as well. I'm sort of time master on this, so I'm going to keep the ball rolling and resist the temptation to carry on going down that particular strand of the conversation and shift over to Emma. I'm going to bring Emma in at this point to see where you'd like to take the conversation. Over to you, Emma. No pressure.
No pressure, no pressure. Yeah, a lot that all really resonated, and absolutely agree with you on the kind of Gladwell stuff. It plays into something we talk a lot about on this show, which is I'm an ex-academic, and I have a real frustration and passion for trying to bring the world of academia close to the world of applied practical business, because there's so much stuff that we know to be true that seems to just completely bypass the world of business. I think it's really interesting, talking about, yes, absolutely the C-suite are, and many others, are very data driven. Of course they are, we know they are, but actually, to your point, Sam, you know, the emotional piece is the fact that there's still so many outdated practices that happen despite our best efforts at going, look, this doesn't work. And that's a real frustration. There's a real paradox there. So that's just a bit of a reflection from me. For example, I always quote the industry, the billion-dollar industry of comp and bends and reward and bends, and how the way employees are often rewarded, we know, just doesn't work. Anyway, that's a whole other research show. What I'm really interested in, you know, I kind of obviously done a bit of reading around you, Sam, and you know, the book I've just downloaded that I'm desperate to read, you know, is telling stories with data, and that's really I think that's really exciting. But I feel, even as someone who's written books, although they're not fiction books, I love stories. We do a load of work around strategic narrative. I think it's quite difficult. Do you think it is? And what tips can you give us to take data and make it interesting for people and tell a story with it, so people take notice of it and use it and do something with it? What ideas have you got for that?
Well, you know, once you get through the sequel, you can read the prequel, because my good friends at Routledge in 2018 published a book called Narrative by Numbers: How to Tell Powerful and Purposeful Stories with Data. And guess what the central message of that is? The central message of that is to be human and empathetic and understanding of your audience. So to talk human, to know your audience, and you can use data to know and understand your audience, to understand who you're talking to. So if you are the other hat, apart from an insightful thinking I wear, and Perry, it would be a Boston Red Sox rather than a New York Yankees hat, but there we are. The other hat I wear is as a data storyteller. If you pin me into the corner of a bar when we're allowed back into bars, I would say I am a data storyteller, or I help organizations use data smarter to do two things. One is to tell better stories, and two is to innovate and to get to insights that you can unlock. So talking human, finding and using relevant data. I mean, that's a kind of a sort of circular statement of the obvious, but finding and using genuinely relevant data. I mean, the example I always give is, I'm sure I can give you a link for the show notes if you want for the podcast. It's not hard to find, is the British Heart Foundation, I think it was 2011-12 campaign that Vinnie Jones fronted. And what they wanted to do was to show the world, to educate people without sending them on CPR courses, how they should be doing CPR. First of all, they shouldn't be trying to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, because that almost always fails. So you have Vinnie Jones, this former footballer turned East End villain in Guy Ritchie B movies, in a disused garage with some geezer who's just had a heart attack in front of you, and he says, don't kiss them on the lips, you only kiss your missus on the lips. It wasn't because he was being a Neanderthal sexist that he said that. He was saying that because BHF didn't want people to try and do mouth to mouth, because it doesn't work. People don't know how to do it. They feel too repelled and so on. But so it's such a memorable ad, because it combines this East End hood and his henchmen and a couple of Dobermans with the Bee Gees track Staying Alive. Because it just so happens the planners discovered that if you push 110 to 120 beats per minute, the same as that Bee Gees track, that's what you need to do on the heart. You know, it's a great bit of data storytelling. They're finding and using truly relevant data. I mean, I think knowing your audience, tailoring the story for your audience, exactly as you say, Emma, it's vital. It's absolutely vital that you know who you're talking to. I mean, it should be whatever meeting you're having, whatever Zoom you're on, whatever conference you're addressing. If you're going into a primary school and it's bring your parents to work day, you're not going to give them necessarily an enormous Excel spreadsheet and talk them through the pivot tables. Probably not. If you've got a meeting with the chief finance officer, that may well be what they want and they expect. But so finding and using relevant data, talking human, the curse of knowledge. So I've mentioned Steve Pinker before. He wrote another really, not about psychology really at all, but about, he wrote a book called The Sense of Style. Which is the academic's guide to writing clearly. And Emma, you didn't describe yourself as a recovering academic, but I could tell that word recovering was just beneath the surface. Yeah, I've got the same myself. and the curse of knowledge is the inability that many people have, particularly academics, government officials, financial advisors, lawyers. I mean, really, I'm not being rude about any of those groups, scientists generally, the difficulty of imagining, and this is a failure of empathy again, it all comes back to empathy, the difficulty of imagining that the people that you're talking to don't know what you already know. It's really hard to do that. And this isn't about dumbing down or making things simplistic. It's about simplifying. Simplification is not a dirty word. I think simplifying. So simplification is not a dirty word. But dumbing down, that is a bit of a dirty word. But if you can't put yourself in the mind of, as so many academics cannot, if you can't put yourself in the minds of those that you're looking to teach, to instruct, to bring along, to lead as a leader in an organization, if you can't not remember what it was like not to know it, but imagine what it's like not to know it, then you'll use too much data. You'll drown people in data. I've got many of my best friends are market researchers. Many of my favorite clients are big market research companies. But how many times have you been in a market research debrief and you see slides 1 to 162? Because you're going to get every single cross tabulation they've done. And that's, one, not empathetic, but two, people will start playing on their phones. It's a little bit disaster. So those would be a few of my hints and tips on being a better data storyteller. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, and I just to say, with the staying alive thing, I've got a 12-year-old boy in the background who's actually doing it to staying alive. So he's just been acting it out, and he's going, "That's great. I remember that."
But it is worth watching it, partly because it's the juxtaposition of the two, which makes it emotional, which makes it memorable. I mean, he's got these two henchmen. They look like the Mitchell brothers, or Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane, as I like to call them. He looks like, but they're wearing, horrible, ill-fitting leather jackets, and they start dancing away. They're having a fantastic time. Even the dog's nodding its head by the end of it. But the other thing about that in data storytelling, so you get that killer, if you'll excuse me, statistic. But the other one is, he says, push down on the sovereign, because in his world everyone has a medallion. But push down 5 or 6 centimeters, that's about 2 inches in old money. He's talking to younger and older. We live in this strange country where Blue Peter ran a debate when I was a kid. Shall we use metric or imperial? Oh, we'll use both.
And Sam, I posted the link to that YouTube, and also, I don't want to get distracted, but I also posted a link to How Not to Do It, which is an article that you posted on LinkedIn. So that's something for everyone to check out afterwards as well.
Nightmare on Downing Street.
Nightmare on Downing Street. Classic. I'm going to hand back over to Belinda to start to move us into the final furlong, I think. Over to you, B.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze this question into the last few minutes that we've got, which is a big question. So, Sam, and you cover your STEP model brilliantly in the book, so we won't have time to go into all of that. But I'd love to pose this question to you: what can we all do to be more insightful? What are some top tips of being more insightful as individuals in our lives? That might be at work or at home or wherever.
Be curious. Be endemically curious. Not just about the brief that you're working on today, not just about the insight problem, and there's a big difference between insight and analytical problems, but one of them yields to work and the other one doesn't. But so be curious, be absolutely curious, because you never know when your subconscious is going to do that brilliant thing of putting things together. So definitely be curious. Read podcasts, listen to podcasts like this, listen to absorb stuff, just be a sponge. But I think one of the kind of the palace revolution bit, and the thing that I find that leaders find to be threatening, is to take time out, and to take time out away from the challenge of trying to get to insight. Now, the reason that I think that is really important is because if you don't do that, and if you try and work and work and work away, then you're mistaking an insight problem for an analytical problem, and you're preventing your subconscious, I think, from doing that brilliant recombinatorial thing. Now, taking time out can mean lots and lots of things to people. It can mean working on another client's piece of work. It can mean doing your timesheets and expenses. It can mean coming on a lunchtime webinar or listening to a podcast. It can mean exercise, particularly. I mean, I in marketing communications, the people that are more strategic and are required to find insights are known as planners. And I don't know a planner who doesn't either run or I think. But are you still sea swimming, Belinda? Still in the sea?
Yes,
yeah,
yes, I am.
Good. Yeah, my wife too. Absolutely. And it's only January and -3. Maybe too. Are you a sea swimmer? No, it's not a sea swimmer. I thought there was a nod there, but no. So exercise is really, really good. Exercise, doing mundane things. I mean, so three of my favourite things in the world are washing up, mowing the lawn, and ironing, because because they have a beginning. No, because they have a beginning, middle, and an end. How often when we're doing things do we say, oh, we make little tick lists, but it's only a little tiny bit of the project that we've ticked off. But also that because you use procedural memory to do them, because you know how to do them, then you do them, and that allows you to maybe get slightly closer to some of the combinations that are going on subconsciously. But the timeout thing, in the Insight book, there's I talk to people from all sorts of different worlds, be it Peter Firth, the actor, and his partner Alexandra McKibben, who met on Letter to Brezhnev and had lives apart but came back together. But actors, how do actors get inside the mind of others? I spoke to the head of performance at the Royal College of Music. What is the insight to musicians? Psychiatrists, psychologists. Also spoke to Susan Greenfield, who used to run the Royal Institution, Baroness Susan Greenfield, who is she's doing pioneering work in Alzheimer's now, Alzheimer's therapies. But she opened my mind and my eyes to a school of psychology from the Netherlands, environmental psychology, that talks about the importance of getting somewhere big, getting outside and getting somewhere big. So when we get somewhere big, particularly a desert, the middle of the ocean, or a mountain, but also, the countryside, or even a park, when we're not at a desk, and I came across, I'll come back to John le Carré in a second in my butterfly mind, but getting somewhere big effectively makes time slow down. The reason it effectively makes time slow down is because there are fewer competing stimuli for your attention, and therefore it feels like time slowed down because you can process consciously and subconsciously more stimuli in the same amount of time. So get somewhere big in your time out. The Le Carré quote I came across today on LinkedIn, I love it. I hadn't heard it before, but it seems like everybody else has, is that a desk is a dangerous place from which to view the world. And in a zoomed, locked down world, I think that government spokespeople should just give that Le Carré quote every day, just to remind people how dangerous a desk is and how important it is, to turn a, as we've discussed before, Belinda, to turn a workshop into a walkshop.
Thank you.
Well, that seems to have brought us to a momentary pause, and I'm going to take advantage of that momentary pause to start to wrap up. Emma and Belinda, have you anything further to say or further questions for Sam before I do the official wrap up of this one and plug for the next one?
I just want to say massive thank you, Sam. Really interesting. Could listen to you for hours, and I'm only down the road in Hastings, so it'd be great to kind of all get in a physical space when we're allowed and carry on the conversations. Fascinating stuff. So huge thank you for me coming along.
Great pleasure.
Lovely, thank you. And any further reflections from our super guests, Debbie, Perry, Nadine, and indeed I'm inviting Neil, Andrea and Jacob to contribute as well at this stage. If any of you would like to either pop a message in the chat or jump in and unmute yourselves. Perry, you're unmuted. Over to you.
I am. So I've often had, I wouldn't say an aversion, but I've been at war with data because it just doesn't interest me. However, art does. So I think what I've experienced today is that there is an art form to take from this, both in looking at the emotions and in also perhaps how you can use and influence people to move them with data. So thank you.
I must just tell you a quick story there. There is a group in the media and advertising world called the Media Research Group, and when these luxurious things were still allowed, this was back in November 2018. I gave a keynote for the Media Research Group in Bratislava, and I had a morning slot. It was lovely. It was great. It was a fantastic place to be. I had a morning slot, and in the evening, there's a guy who trains with who does data visualization training for The Guardian, a guy called Tobias Sturt, and he's very, very good. I did the words, he did the pictures. His entire 45-minute keynote had one slide, and that one slide was Titian's painting of Theseus abandoning Ariadne on the island of Naxos, having killed the Minotaur. He was, Theseus gets a really good press because he killed the Minotaur, but he was really nasty to his girlfriend and abandoned her on an island. But it was all about line and form and art, and it was all about data visualization. Just from that one picture, about cutting the screen, about cutting a screen in half, about the creation of infographics. So thank you, Perry, very much for that comment about this being an art, and it's absolutely about humanity. I could teach people about multivariate analysis of variance and t-tests. Who wants to know about that nonsense? I don't teach statistics at university anymore. I'm really about helping people to communicate with more impact. I genuinely believe that analytics plus storytelling leads to greater influence, equals influence, and that often requires leaving your data at the door in the appendix, hinting at it, not giving endless backstory. When you're watching your favorite box set and they say, oh, by the way, season 4, we've got a character that we should have introduced and it was all a dream. I mean, Lost is the worst example of that in history, but Dallas, all of the backstory is so tedious and turgid, and that's what it feels like when yet another chart comes up, yet another statistic comes up. Intrigue people enough, like a fly fisher person, cast a line on the water, intrigue, say, oh, I'm not sure I agree with that. Tell me more. Then you can open up the data vault of that you've got to say, well, because this and this and this. But don't bore them, because they will play Sudoku on their phone or Yahtzee.
Fantastic. Thank you for your response to Perry's provocation there, and thank you for your provocation, Perry. And finally, just from Jacob, Jacob is new to the show, and I am very impressed. Jacob has just binge watched all of the previous 10 episodes of the Research Show, and is delighted to have been here for his first live recording. And would also like, Sam, quick thought, apart from your book, obviously, what would you recommend for your top tips for further reading, further watching, further exploration? Katie, just to let you know, by the way, while you're thinking about that, Katie's going to go back through the show and collate all of the references to, this is going to take you some time, Katie, to the many books and works of art and all of that have been, you've referred to throughout the show. So Jacob, what you probably don't know yet is that you will get a post-show pack including those resources and the access to the video and the but in the meantime, Sam, top tips for further exploration.
Well, I'm going to make Katie's job a little bit easier because I've got a list for sure that I can share, most of which will be included in that, just because they tend to be things that I talk about often. If you're interested in, it depends if you're interested in kind of data or insightful thinking. I really recommend Tim Harford's book. I really recommend David Spiegelhalter's book from last year, The Art of Statistics. It is technical. I don't think it's going to be top of Perry's Christmas list next year. It is technical, but it's really, really, really good. You could do if you want. I mentioned I was originally a classicist. Aristotle wrote a very thin, very readable, particularly in translation, book called the Poetics, which was about the three forms of art that there were in 4th century Athens, which were comedy, tragedy, and epic poetry. And that is where we get the 3-act structure from. That is where we get the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis, as he called it, where we get the inciting incident that people like Robert McKee, the story Hollywood script writer Strickland talks about, where we get the resolution, but not the end. You need to have a period of resolution. That's where that comes from. But that's not just about writing a box set. That's not just about, you know, writing a novel. That's about making a compelling business case to have your team follow you into battle and use this innovation. That you know, story and story structure is something that we intuitively respond to. This 3-act structure. And talking of story, and I mentioned Robert McKee. Robert McKee's book Story. It's one of the, I mean, he does the courses online, but 3 days, 11 hours listening to Robert McKee, that was one of them. That was, I think, the best training course I've ever been on. But his book, everything he says in his 3-day course is distilled in his book Story, but I'm not being rude about Robert, not his book Storynomics that was written, which is about applying story to business, much better in the authentic, where he knows stuff, which is in Story. So there's a few.
Oh, marvelous. Thank you. Thank you. We've all been making notes there, and Jacob says thank you. Folks, what an absolutely rip-roaring start to 2021. Thank you, Sam. Insight, inspiration, humor, comedy, fantastic. Lots and lots and lots for us to put in our pot and stick it on the stove. I don't know where I'm going with that metaphor, so I'm going to abandon it and go clearly to a plug for the next show, which I don't, if you've watched this one, you hardly need convincing, but just so you know, January the 27th, planning and people expert Adam Gibson will be joining us. So we look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, thank you once again to Sam Knowles, our special studio guest. Thank you to our special audience members. Thank you to my co-hosts. And thank you all for watching and listening. It's been wonderful. I'm excited. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye for now.